So what was it like for you to move to the United States after growing up in Thailand?
Mm,
Or spending a significant part of your childhood in Thailand?
sure. Well, actually, I was born in Thailand, and when I was 2.5, we moved to Texas. So it's kind of reverse
Oh, a
in some
different foreign
ways.
country.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So, like, I actually, my formative years, like what I can remember,
We're in
was
the
in
States.
Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah. But growing up, my parents spoke Thai in the house. So even though we lived in America, the only English exposure I got was on television until I went to kindergarten.
Okay.
So I still had the experience of
Yeah.
being a second language learner um, when I was going into kindergarten. And I remember now that I have taken linguistics and I can understand why I mispronounce things. And phonetically in Thai and in a lot of other Asian languages, we don't have the TH sound. So the was really hard because I actually didn't hear the difference. We don't have that sound. So I didn't realize that I was pronouncing some people's names wrong until one of the other little boys in my class so kindly said to me, Nook, his name is Jonathan, not Jonathan. And I was like, oh, gee, thanks, Mark. I'll remember that from now on. So I guess I've always had a cross-cultural
That's funny.
experience growing
That's
up.
funny.
Yeah.
What impact did that have on your faith? I mean, you grew up in a Christian
Mm,
home, right?
yes.
And were your folks here for study? Is that why you moved to Texas?
Yes. My parents met in Bible college in Thailand, and they always wanted to go into ministry. But what impacted the reason why they came to the States was for school. My dad wanted to get further schooling. I think part of that motivation, though, is because he comes from a minority group in Thailand that's like fairly looked down upon. So he wanted to be able to minister and not have any barriers.
Right.
Not have people make assumptions about him just because of where he was coming from. Unfortunately, he still has to deal with that. But having a doctorate from the United States means a lot
I'm sure that
to
helps.
people. Yeah. Um, how has that impacted my faith?
You grew up in a church situation in the South in the United
Yes.
States, cross-culturally.
Yeah.
What do you think that had? How do you think that helped you or hindered you in your faith development over the years?
I think I've been blessed with growing up that God has always seemed real. Growing up with parents who clearly would sacrifice anything, like moving countries to pursue further tools to then take back to Thailand. I've always seen faith as active. At the same time, I think I've also then had to grapple with what does sacrifice mean, and how faith is not easy. When we moved back to Thailand, it was moving back for my parents, but I had no memory of Thailand.
Right. Yeah.
So that cultural transition was really hard.
Okay.
And that was probably the first time that I had an experience that was widely different from my parents. My parents were going home. I wasn't. And they didn't think to prepare me for that. And that was a period where I was going into middle school. Oh, transitional in and of itself.
Totally.
And then transitioning to a new country. I think that was a big period of loneliness because I didn't have any friends. I had left all of my friends back there, and then the kids that were in Thailand, I didn't have cultural experiences that were similar to them. But fortunately, going into 7th grade, I had a teacher. I went to a school for missionary kids in 7th grade. And
was that English speaking?
English
Okay,
speaking,
English
yeah. And I had a teacher who taught us how to journal with the Bible. And that was the first time that I'd been taught how to process my feelings while also grounding it in scripture. And I think that was really significant for my faith walk because since 7th grade, I've continued to journal and I've continued this habit of reflecting and processing. And I also get to look back on moments of growth,
Right.
or maybe things that have stayed the same and been convicted of that too. Yeah. How about you? You also had experiences cross-culturally. How has that impacted your faith?
Well, it's interesting for me to hear you tell your story because that's exactly what I got interested in. Because when we lived in Korea for 12 years,
Yeah.
I worked with international students who
That's
were moving
right.
back and forth from Korea to their home country, or what their parents considered to be their home country. It was the same story. You know, the parents would have them in Korea maybe, and then they would live there for 3 or 4 years and then go to the parents' home, quote unquote. But
Right.
it wasn't the home for the students, for their children. And there was all kinds of problems. So I ended up studying that. You know, and my overseas time, we lived in Korea for 12 years, and my overseas time there was instrumental in helping me to develop a discipleship mindset in my faith because we had a great community and we would encourage each other and talk with each other and create Bible studies and plans and keep each other accountable and stuff like that. And so moving forward in my faith journey was easy in that setting. And then we experienced a little bit of what you talked about because we moved back to the States because it was the right time. We could just sense that it was the right time.
Yeah.
And we ended up in a secular setting. My wife was teaching in a private school, but it was not a Christian private school. And I was attending a university to get my doctorate, and neither one of us had that faith community present, so we had to find it there. And so we were looking for ways and found a really good church, and were able to find it there. But I think that the community aspect of being where you are was so important in both places. And in one place it was just there, and the other place we really had to look for it. We had to find a way to get that community and the accountability and all that goes along with being in a community like that.
Do you think your experience overseas shaped how you see community and then what you were looking for?
You know, at the time that we were overseas, I would have said that because it was such a rich community and we were so close and everybody, I mean, there was a melding of personalities and we just had a great support group and friendship group and social group and church group. And then we, in subsequent places back in the States, we also found the same thing. Like here, where we are now in our situation, our support group and our community and our church have provided the same kinds of things that we had in Korea. So I'm not so sure that it was being overseas, although the richness of that intercultural experience just can't be discounted. Even though that was the case, I think that those communities of faith and support and encouragement and accountability are everywhere, and you just have to find them. We have to look. If you can't find it, you just have to keep looking because it's there. Now I'm curious about your generational understanding too, because you're Thai and you're American.
Yeah.
And you've gotten your education in American universities, and you're involved in an American situation now, U.S. situation now, and yet you're still in a different generation from my generation. And how is your generation? How's the philosophy of your generation affected your faith development?
That's interesting. I wonder, I don't know if I have any statistics to back this up, but I think my generation tends to be suspicious of structures,
Okay.
especially faith-based structures. I think they've observed maybe the generations before them be very rigid and be very principled, but I think at times people have chosen principles over relationship. And I think I see that as a shift in my generation. And even in some people in the generations ahead of us too, who are taking a step back and thinking, but how are we also in relationship with people? Because I think that change happens in community and transformation. So if we're not in relationship, then how do we help with that transformation? So I think sometimes my generation can err on choosing relationship, and they struggle with knowing when to speak in love. But at the same time, I think they can do that. I know I've learned that when to speak out in love too, but I have an established relationship with people so that when those feelings are hurt, they know that I'm still there for them. Whereas I wonder if in the past that relationship hasn't always been there, and people have relied on the structures to bring people back, and they found that the structures aren't strong enough to bring people back.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think? What have you observed?
Well, yeah, I agree with you, actually. That I think that growing up in my generation, it was, at least my experience in my generation, was much more legalistic. We had a lot more rules. And the rules were really sacred, in a sense. And if you broke the rules, it was really bad. That was a bad thing. And it didn't really matter. The relationships mattered less. I can't say they didn't matter at all, but they mattered less because the rules were what really mattered. And being faithful to the structure was really the key to the kingdom. We had all kinds of markers of that, things that people would do or not do. If they did those things, they obviously were outside. If they didn't do those things, or if they did it's not doing and not doing on both sides. If they did those things or didn't do those things, certain things, they were outside. But if they did do some things or didn't do other things, they could be inside because we had the markers of that. And I think that as I've aged, which I have done, I've come to the place where I don't think that the structure is as important. I can't say that we need to do away with structure completely, but I can't say that the structure is as important, but the relationships. However, the other side of the coin too is I've noticed that, I think you might have referred to this a little bit. I've noticed that when people get into relationships, then they allow the relationships to be the lens with which they look at their faith, rather than having their faith be the lens with which they look at their relationships.
Right.
And I think somewhere in the middle, there's a balance of, don't get too tied up in the structure so that it becomes your idol.
Right.
I think I was just talking with some friends yesterday about the fact that any formula that we want to use in order to become more faithful to Jesus is wrong. Because eventually the formula becomes the point, and the relationship to Jesus fades to the background. And I don't know that's a pretty drastic statement, but for me, that's been true. Anytime I come up with a formula for faith, that has been eventually the point, and my relationship with Jesus takes a little bit of a back seat. So I try to stay away from the formula or the structure and just focus on the relationship recently, in the more recent years, in the last couple of years.
Yeah, or I think that's funny. So your saying is, don't just follow the formula.
Right.
And I think, to counteract what I think my generation has been suspicious of structures, but at the same time, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly.
Because there are certain structures or traditions that we have that are really rich. And I think I've learned that. I'm Wesleyan now, but I actually grew up Baptist. And I think Baptists, at least in the faith tradition that I've been raised in, they are very reactive to not having anything that reminds them of the Catholic Church traditions.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until I came to college that I was more exposed to liturgy and prayers that have been written centuries before me. And as I started to learn more about the rich history there and to think critically about, like, if God exists outside of time, and I'm reading this prayer, and this is a prayer that others have gone before me and read. Like, if he's hearing all of those so simultaneously, I think that is an incredible picture of how much bigger our faith is than just the individual. And I think that's a part that sometimes we lose
Totally.
when we get afraid of being part of the big C church.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that goes well with. I totally agree with that. That actually confirms some things that I read in a book by James Smith not that long ago called "You Are What You Love," and he talks about the fact that if we don't look back to some of the prayers of the saints and the old time hymns from centuries maybe ago, that we lose the connection of the modern day church to the church universal or the church historic, and that we really need to put some emphasis on the history of the church in our current worship, as well as the fact that it's spontaneous and that there's emotion in it, and that we're experiencing it right now, and that we're engaging Jesus in the moment, and those things which are really important. But it doesn't take away the fact that there's a cloud of witnesses out there that includes the historical church.
Right.
So I really agree with that. I think somewhere there's a balance between the structure and the liturgy and the history and all of the things that we want to connect with there, and the relationship and the community and things like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we talked about the historical church and kind of our generations. What about culturally, thinking about the church in Thailand, the church, I also experienced the church in China. You experienced the church in Korea. You were also in South America, right?
In Honduras.
Honduras. What was your experience like with the church there?
In Honduras? The church in Honduras is a lot like what we're kind of seeing as it's not new by any means, but another unfolding of the house church movement, because the churches that I was involved with were small and met in homes. And I actually had the job of being the driver for all of the people who ministered in those homes. So I would leave on Sunday morning, early in the morning, with a van full of preachers, you might say, or pastors, and we would go out into the countryside, and every mile or so I would drop off one or two, and until I get to the end, and then I would stay there and have my worship service there, and then I'd come back and we would pick them all up as we went back to the station. And they were all small churches that met in homes, and we're seeing a new movement of that now, the house church movement, with a whole lot less technology back then than what we're seeing now. Anyway, it was very much like that, and they're very vibrant. They believed in spontaneity, but they also believed in Bible study and prayer and understanding the theology of the Bible, and so it was a pretty vibrant church growth movement in that country at that time. Now that was 40 years ago, so I don't know exactly how it's happening today, but that was the way it was in Honduras. And in Korea, it was the opposite. It was the mega church, the largest church in the world's in Korea, 750,000 members, and they're, the largest Methodist church in the world is in Korea, and the largest Baptist church in the world is in Korea, and because they attract many, many people into one setting, and that's sort of the culture of Korea. Is people gather together in large groups. The cities are enormous. That Seoul was about the size of maybe Lexington, Kentucky, but it had 12 million people in it when we were there, and so they congregate in density in Korea. But even then, the churches were strong because of the small community groups. The largest church in the world, David Cho's church, had 750,000 members, but they had 70,000 small groups that met every week with a trained leader in that group. Every single group had a trained leader. And so it was the small group, the community, that really was the genius, God-given genius of the church growth, of that church's growth. So it's really culturally, churches are different. People respond in different ways to different kinds of situations. Populations matter. You had an
Sure.
experience in East Asian churches too.
Right, yeah. I think in East Asia, a lot of times churches have to be small due to government influences. And I also think that my experience in East Asia helped me value intergenerational interactions more because of the bodies that I was a part of. We maybe had one or two people over the age of 50 because faith, I don't think Christianity is new to East Asia, but it was fragmented. That government control definitely, in some ways, it pushes people to be sure that they want to be in the faith or
Right.
not.
Yeah.
But that government control also splinters the church there. And I was part of a body with expatriates, so you have to have a visa to be there, and visas weren't granted to people who were over a certain age. And so that's part of why our body didn't have very many older voices. And so in some ways, we were all in similar walks of life, but sometimes that's a problem.
Yeah, right.
Because you don't have a different perspective, or you don't have the perspective of people who have walked before you. And hindsight is 2020, and none of us had hindsight. Or only a couple of us did, and maybe they didn't want to be the dissenting voices. So I think my experience with the church in East Asia helped me value intergenerational interactions more. And that also then gave me an idea of what I was looking for in a church when I came back to the States. And I think it also helped me value structures in a different way.
Right.
Because people don't necessarily have access over there to seminaries that are full of young pastors, specialized pastors, youth pastors, worship pastors. And these people have tools and education, whereas over there, sometimes you just served in a capacity because that's what you needed to do, not because that was where you were gifted in or what you had experience
Right.
in. Even your experience in Honduras, right? You drove because that's what your church needed. But that wasn't necessarily your strength.
Oh, that's pretty good. But
Well, I'm glad.
no,
Yeah.
you're right. I had more theological training, but also realized the need for more during that time there. So
Is that
Yeah.
what your time in Honduras, did that lead you back to wanting to?
it led me back to seminary, actually, to get my Master of Divinity. And it's a long story after that. But I think what you're talking about with the churches in East Asia and the practicality of it and the intergenerational nature or the lack of it in some settings is some of the stuff that I've seen change over time in my life experience in church and in community. Is that when I grew up, I think churches were smaller. At least we were involved in many more smaller churches. And now the megachurch movement is big. I think, that has pros and cons, of course.
Right.
But one of the pros, I think, is intergenerational membership. So like in a Sunday school class, you might have people who are late high school or college or maybe young adults, and you might have people who are retired in the same class or the same small group. And to me, that's a rich cross section of the population that helps us all to learn and grow. Right. And maybe older people are needed for their experiences and the life experiences that they can bring to the table. But the new ideas and the new thinking of younger people is also valuable, and we need to have all of that in. And that's a big change that's happened over my lifetime, is from the church when you walk in and all the hair is like mine, it's all white, to a mixture, and a real cross-generational population there.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of it.
Yeah, I think that's great.
I think one of the topics that's coming to the surface more and more is about equity and justice. And people have mixed feelings about that. Some people do. what are your thoughts? Yeah.
It sort of fits with what we were talking about earlier with structures versus relationships in a sense. Because I think that people early on in my church experience would have been much more rigid in their understanding of what equity or equality and justice might be. And I think we're getting more of the understanding of the person that's involved or the people groups involved as we grow in this. I definitely believe that the church should be at the core of equity and justice conversations, that it's all through the scripture, that there's no inequity or injustice, injustice in the scriptures. And if we really follow the scriptures from beginning to end, we would be in the middle of those conversations and not trying to back out or move away or put ourselves on the margin. There's enough marginalization of Christians anyway. We really ought to be forcing ourselves into those conversations as a church. And I don't think that was the case. I think there was much more. This is my opinion, and it could be wrong, but I think when I was younger, there was much more division about equity. As a matter of fact, I think some denominations actually were divided on that. One denomination would be into equity and justice, and another one would say social gospel and reject that denomination. And now I think we're finding less of that, and I think that's a positive move in the church. What do you think? You're younger and you're right in the middle of that right now, but what do you think?
Yeah, I believe that that's at the core of what it means to be a Christian, and to seek reconciliation is not just reconciliation between us and God, but then if that's true reconciliation, then we cannot stop but to look outward and see what barriers are keeping other people from being reconciled to God and with one another. And even in the Wesleyan tradition, I think, like you're saying, denominations separated from each other, like Wesleyan separated over, I remember it as free people and free pews. In that, as Wesleyans, we said that slavery is not okay. And it's not just a social issue. This is an issue that the church cannot turn a blind eye to, because that's a barrier to the fullness of community and God. And then free pews, is that back in the day you had to pay for the pew that you sat in, and the more expensive pews were the ones that were closer to the front where you could hear better and closer to heat source. And so the poor people were being pushed further back. And that, again, is not a social issue. We see the issue of sin maybe projected into society, but the root is that there's a reconciliation problem there with people and with God. And if you're okay sitting at the front listening to God, or if you're okay sitting at the front listening to the pastor, knowing that there are people at the back who can't hear clearly and aren't having the same access, that's a problem.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
Right. I agree.
And
I
think regardless of our generation, if we were all to look at that, we would feel the same passion of wanting people to access God. But I don't know where this rhetoric comes from of trying to separate and compartmentalize what is the gospel versus what is a social need. Yeah.
You don't know where that comes from?
No.
It's definition of what it is what the church is about. When the church believed that, when the more conservative evangelical church believed that only preaching for salvation was the only thing that was the real job of the church, then anything else was moving into social gospel, which they would want to separate. If you weren't having people come down to the altar to receive Christ as personal Savior, you were not preaching the gospel.
Interesting.
And I think now we see more of a melding of that, so that it's not one or the other, but both of those are involved in the gospel message.
Right.
And I think that's a really positive move. And I think, it dies hard. I don't think everybody is there. I think still, even now, for some people, the term social gospel is is a curse word almost. It's like you definitely don't want to be there. Back off.
Right.
But other people, many other people, much of the core of the church, I think, is getting to a place where the social gospel and the personal salvation gospel are coming together as one thing,
Right.
one whole gospel, a holistic look at the gospel.
Because you can't separate social from being a person.
Right.
Right. Like,
Yeah. I mean, that's almost funny to think of social and personal being different.
right. Because if God wanted us to just be individuals, he would have stopped at Adam, right?
Yeah.
But he created, there was a speaker here a while ago, Brian Bantam. He said that creating Adam was the first thing that God created in the Bible. He looked at it and said, I could do better. And so he added another person. And yeah, we needed another.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. So how do you experience Jesus these days?
I definitely experience Jesus through community and through relationships. I feel God is tangible to me through the relationships that I have with people. Yeah. How about you?
I'm almost the opposite.
Yeah.
I experience Jesus a lot in silence and solitude. And I'm hungry for those times when I can just be alone and sit with his word and just experience him. And I think it really started a long time ago, but it increased a couple of years ago when I went to a retreat where we talked about contemplative prayer and what that is and how to just sit and allow your mind to focus on Jesus alone. And that was the beginning of another part of the journey for me. And that it's rich. It's a rich thing. Now I also enjoy being in community and with relationships. I love worship services and times when we have communal togetherness in our worship. But that the silence and solitude of my daily walk, those two things are really, really special for me.
Yeah, I think that's where I learned from you for sure is enjoying the solitude and the alone time and learning how rich that is. That's something that has not been second nature to me, but as I've gotten older, I've learned to cultivate that alone time because in that time it grounds me so that I can then be that much more engaging with people and in community. But it's only through that time with God, just with him, and just with myself too. Yeah.
I also believe that when this is a biblical concept, and when you hang out with people, you become like them. There's a negative Bible verse, actually. It says, bad company corrupts good character. And I think the other side of that works too. Good company also helps you to develop good character. And I think when we hang out with Jesus, we become more like him.
Yeah.
We actually grow in the direction of being more like him. And so spending time in his word, which is, I am the word, he's the word. And also with him in silence and allowing ourselves to just be in his presence, I think is transforming in and of itself.
Right.
And I think that affects the way we are when we go away from that too. Well, what I hope is that in time that I will grow in the areas of, I will continue to grow in the areas of the fruit of the Spirit, which I think helps us to look more like Jesus, to be more like Jesus. But that's over time, and I don't think I'm there yet.
Well, I like thinking about that, though, is thinking about the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience. Because sometimes when we say people need to look more like Jesus, we're viewing it through a cultural lens. And I think I'm reminded of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Life Together. and he talks about, I'm going to misquote him though, essentially that what I think Jesus is supposed to look like in the other is not what I expect at all.
Right.
And he said, I don't understand it. Even the picture of Christ on the cross was an image that I didn't understand at first. And sometimes we look too much at the physical, maybe, aspects. And I appreciate that you bring up the fruits of the Spirit. Patience can look widely different,
Right.
depending on your personality, depending on your context. Yeah.
And knowing exactly what Jesus looks like, I think is hard too. And I don't mean it physically either. I mean in terms of his. We get a picture in the Bible, but if you think that your image of your own father has something to do with the image of God or image of Jesus, you're not going to be right, because no matter how good or how bad your father was, it's not Jesus. That's not who that is. So we have to figure out from His Word more about who He is. And I think as we grow and develop, we're still figuring that out. It's figuring out who Jesus is that we're doing when we're discipling ourselves to Him. We're wanting to become more like Him, and we're in the process of figuring out what that means every day.